Our next key question is, who were the main campaigners for women's suffrage in Victorian Britain? Firstly, I want to think about how people can campaign for change. So on your own, we think about what different ways would you campaign for change, and try and think of as many as you possibly can. Pause the video and think about this for several moments. So first of all, we need to consider, what is suffrage? Now, suffrage means two things, both the right to vote and the right to stand for election. And ultimately, this means the right to become an MP. Now, many people forget that in Victorian Britain, women were fighting for both rights, because they realised that it wasn't enough just to have the vote to try and pressure men to change the law. They also needed women in Parliament who would continue that fight and actually push the men to make those changes. So as we mentioned before, there was more than one women's group who were looking to try and push change at this time. Two main organisations are normally known as the suffragists, or the National Union of Women's Suffrage Societies, the NUWSS, or the suffragettes, the Women's Social and Political Union, the WSPU. We'll be looking at both of these groups today, where they came from and how they differed in their aims. Now, before either of these groups, we saw some early campaigns which started in the 19th century. The first campaign of note was in 1866. A petition was put together with 1,500 signatures demanding the right to vote. This developed into 1867. Lydia Becker formed the Manchester Society for Women's Suffrage, so you started to see the first suffrage groups. And others followed in London, Bristol, Birmingham and Edinburgh. But I'm sure you can see that 1,500 signatures is not very much, and at this point it was very much a regional organisations trying to push for change. So these regional organisations ended up becoming the NUWSS. In 1897, Millicent Fawcett linked these organisations to create the National Union of Women's Suffrage Societies, turning it from regional to national organisation. This was far more powerful with a national organisation and was able to get far more people behind the movement. By 1914, they had 400 branches and over 100,000 members, showing the scope and scale of the organisation. They're a democratic organisation with an elected president and committee, but they elected Fawcett to be president for 20 years in a row, and she was effectively dominated it throughout our period. Who were the members of the NUWSS? They were mostly women, and they were mostly middle class. As an organisation, they didn't just campaign for suffrage, they campaigned across a range of women's rights issues, such as equality in marriage and equality in the workplace. They did have some working class members, particularly in the north of England, for example in Bolton and Blackburn, and crucially, they allowed men to join the organisation, and many of the campaigners were men. Now, after this group, we see the birth of the WSPU. In 1903, Emmeline Pankhurst and her two daughters, Christabel and Sylvia, created the WSPU, or the suffragettes. They were former suffragists who become frustrated with the movement, and because they're mostly impatient with the peaceful methods. They also had branches all over the country, though not quite as popular as the NUWSS. And crucially, they were controlled entirely by the Pankhurst family and did not try and have a democratic structure. Their aims are slightly different as well. The aim overall was the same, looking for women's suffrage, but they had different ways of achieving it. They believed in female-only membership, and probably most importantly, they used the phrase deeds, not words, implying more action, less talking around the issues. And they focused completely on the vote, not on women's rights or other issues such as equality in marriage. They also had a different approach to their tactics. The Pankhursts, as I said already, were impatient with the peaceful methods of the NUWSS and started to look at different methods. From 1905, they attended meetings and protested, often resulting in violence and arrest. And Christabel Pankhurst was charged and went to prison in 1905, creating a great publicity. They were at a Liberal Party meeting and she started shouting, "Will the Liberal government give the women the vote?" The police tried to remove them, and when they did that, she spat in one face and then hit him in the mouth. She was arrested and charged and decided to go to prison rather than paying a fine. This created massive publicity, and actually there were 2,000 people waiting to meet her when she left prison. So the WSPU saw the success and the impact of these militant actions and realised that maybe the peaceful methods of the NUWSS were not effective and they should use these more violent, more attention-grabbing tactics. So in summary, there are two main groups who fought for women's rights. We have the NUWSS, or the suffragists, who unified regional organisations in 1897 under militant forces' leadership. They worked with men to try and improve women's rights, and they had a wide organisation and were based on democratic principles and mostly used peaceful methods. Then you have the WSPU, or the suffragettes. They were formed and controlled by the Pankhurst family in 1903. They had an impatience with peaceful methods and they started to use violence, and they believed in focusing on the vote and only allowing women's members. So, our key question for us really is, what would you say were the key differences between the suffragettes, or the National Union of Women's Suffrage Societies, the NUWSS, and the suffragettes, or the Women's Social and Political Union, the WSPU? This is a key question throughout the whole of this course, is what were the differences between the two organisations, and which do you think would have the greatest success, and why? Thank you for listening.